What is going on, guys? My name is Toma, and tonight I am bringing you my first ever Toma Tales. If you guys enjoy tales that will leave you sitting at the edge of your seat in excitement, stay tuned because I have many more to come. Today's tale is titled, It Didn't Know Whether to Walk or Crawl. Let's get right into it, guys, and I hope you enjoy it. George, Sarah, and Tom are three lifelong friends who grew up in the same neighborhood located in Aspen, Colorado. George is 15 years old, and so is Sarah. Tom is George's 12-year-old younger brother who loves to tag along and eventually became a part of the friend group. Together, the three are knuckleheads who love to go on adventures and never fail to find one. Here's a story of their adventure. Tom, wake up, we need to head out soon. George had jumped out of bed, seemingly very eager for another summer day to begin. Tom, still in bed, gave his older brother an empty groan, which was interrupted by George's cell phone ringing. "Shut up, it's Sarah," George announced while picking up the call. "Are you guys ready?" Sarah exclaimed, full of determination. George, in an attempt to hide the fact that it was 10:45 a.m. and they were supposed to meet Sarah at her house at 11, gave a nervous chuckle and said, "Tom is still in bed. I've been trying to wake him up for 30 minutes. "Liar!" Tom shouted in defense of himself while rocketing out of bed. George laughed and shoved Tom, saying, "I knew that would get you out of bed." "Of course you guys aren't ready. What's new?" Sarah said. "We'll be there in 15, don't worry." "I wouldn't miss this," George announced before hanging up the call. "Get dressed, Tom. I'll meet you downstairs in 5. Okay, I'll be there." George tumbled down the stairs and was greeted by a note on the kitchen table. "See you when I get off work. Don't be home later than 8 p.m. Love, Mom." George loved summer days, as it meant he and Tom would be home alone for the majority of the day due to his mom's summer job at the local elementary school. George proceeded to grab a snack from the cupboard as an alternative to a breakfast when Tom came racing down the stairs. "Are you ready? Are you ready? Let's do this. Grab me a snack too," Tom yelled throughout the house. George flung Tom an extra snack, and both began trotting into the garage where their bikes were. "Hurry up, let's go, and put your helmet on," George said to Tom, who gave an unenthusiastic response of, Yeah. Together, they began riding their bikes to Sarah's house, who lived 3 blocks away on Turner Avenue. It was a beautiful summer day. Birds were out chirping, and the sun radiated its smile for miles to come. For George and Tom, this was a typical summer day in Colorado, and they were much more worried about which one of them would beat the other to Sarah's house first. A race for the ages that took place nearly every day. "Hurry up, loser!" George yelled at a struggling Tom who once again was losing the race. The wind was brushing by, slamming into Tom's helmet as he pushed forward for one final attempt to pass his older brother George. Despite the immense effort, Tom's fastest speed only amounted to George's comfortable and playful swerving speed. As George continued to poke fun at Tom for being slow, he had arrived at Sarah's house. Sarah was already out front, witnessing another instance where George was making fun of Tom for being the younger brother who always lost. "Stop being a butthead and leave him alone," Sarah told George as Tom finally arrived at her house as well. "Are you guys ready for this?" Sarah eagerly asked Tom and George. "You better be, Tom, or else you're going to get eaten alive." A humorous George laughed. "I'm more ready than anyone," a determined Tom announced. "You guys know this could be dangerous. Did you bring your walkie-talkies?" "Yeah, we have 'em," George replied to Sarah. "It's going to be about a 1.5 hour bike ride until we get there," he added on. You might be wondering what they're doing and where they're going, and I can tell you. George, Tom, and Sarah lived in an area where they were surrounded by a lot of nature and opportunity to explore. Given this, they were always scouring newspapers for any weird or unexplainable sightings nearby. What had them so excited today was what they read in Nature Explorer's section of the newspaper. Local hilltop resident shares his horrific encounter with tall, unidentifiable creature who reportedly stood around 7 feet tall with a very slender and bony structure. According to 32-year-old Brian Hoyer, he was out walking his dog around noon in the mongoose forest when his dog alerted him of the creature who stared at them from a mere 10 feet away. Brian describes it as not being able to decide if it wanted to walk or crawl. "Bunch of baloney," George confidently muttered. "If I see that thing, I'm going to whip out my slingshot and kill it." George continued to joke. You better be, because I'm going to be running, Tom joked as well. You guys are idiots. We'll be lucky if we even see a normal human there. Let's get going. We want to get there to the forest around 1 o'clock so we have enough time to explore, Sarah added on. Both George and Tom shouted, "Let's do it!" before they all hopped on their bikes and began their journey to the mongoose forest. The journey began through familiar neighborhoods and terrains, with Tom, George, and Sarah all enjoying each other's company while cycling. They had been a half hour into the bike ride when unfamiliarity and new sightings became the normal, with each mile seeming to inch closer and closer to nature. Not another hill, Tom complained while gasping behind George and Sarah. The wind was also not helping, as its pathway was opposite to theirs, making each pedal seem like an underwater activity. You guys remember that adventure we went on 2 weeks ago? George reminisced. That was so crazy. I thought I was going to be stuck there for weeks. Well, next time don't run away from us and fall down a hole, Sarah, Tom joked. Those walkies really came in handy, or else you really could still be down there today, said George. The three continued on cycling through the scenic land, which offered fresh air and complete isolation as they traveled on a small pathway with a thin tree line on both sides. It was evident that they were getting really close to the destination, as you could feel their excitement levels rising by the second. How much longer? Tom asked. We should almost be there, maybe another mile or two, George answered. Do you know where that guy saw the creature? Shouldn't be hard to find. The newspaper said he was walking on Pinecone Trail, George answered Sarah. George, Sarah, and Tom continued their journey, with a thick and dense tree line now surrounding them. Despite the three living in Aspen their whole lives, they had never been to this forest before. This was completely new territory and a completely new adventure. The time was 1:38 p.m. The ride had taken longer than expected, but the three had finally made it to Mongoose Forest. Let's put our bikes over here. We can chain them all together on this tree, George announced. While scouring the bikes and placing it in its correct position, Tom was noticeably spooked. Shouldn't it be lighter out? Why is it so dark here? Are you already scared, Tom? You haven't even seen the torturous creature yet, George joked in reply. You guys have your walkie-talkies ready? Yeah, I think we're all ready, Sarah. Are you ready to have some fun, Tom? George humored towards his younger brother. Of course, nothing can scare me. George, Tom, and Sarah began walking to the forest, with their attention not being focused on trees and plants, but on a supposed creature lurking deep within Pinecone Trail. The weather was still sunny. However, the large, thick trees were enormous in number and only allowed very little direct sunlight to enter. The temperature had also dropped, as the leaves rattled and danced with the wind. The only noise the three could hear was a subtle wind and their own footsteps as they approached a sign. Woodmill Trail, 0.8 miles to the left, and Pinecone Trail, 0.5 miles to the right. So, should we go to Woodmill Trail instead? A sarcastic Tom asked. Yeah, you should. The Voldemort lookalike is probably waiting there because he knows you're a chicken, his older brother announced. The pathway seemed very narrow and led deep into the forest with seemingly no one there except the three of them. So, who leads the way? Tom asked. Well, my right arm kind of hurts, so my slingshot won't be as effective. I think Sarah should lead the way. Of course, the two scared guys always making the girl go first. Let's get going before the silence scares you guys. With that being said, Sarah, George, and Tom, in that order, began their much-anticipated stroll through the Pinecone Trail. George, with his slingshot in hand, feeling confident as always, told Tom and Sarah that they'd be lucky if they even saw a squirrel. You'll be lucky if I don't kick you in the back of your leg, Tom quickly replied, which resulted in George turning around and tripping Tom to the ground. Ooh, he's gonna get you if you don't get up, George mockingly told Tom. Can you guys shut up and focus on the task at hand? So immature. Yes, ma'am, George and Tom replied. As they had walked around 10 minutes into the trail, there was still nothing noticeable except for George and Tom singing Now That We're Men from their favorite SpongeBob movie. This was a recurring theme as each adventure solidified them as a grown adult. Everything was still quiet and calm. However, as they continued on deeper and deeper into the forest, they all noticed how much darker and eerie it had gotten. The gush of winds had halted. The trees now stood quiet, and the leaves followed the same pattern. Do you guys agree that it's awfully quiet? Like, I don't hear any animals or anything, Sarah announced. They're probably just sleeping, George responded in an attempt to ease his own tensions. Tom, however, seemed a bit more nervous as the dark and hollow setting began to leave his head turning in every which direction. In an attempt to divert his thoughts, Tom grabbed his walkie-talkie out of his pocket and began to channel George and Sarah's lines. "Hey guys, it's Tom." The voice echoed twice through George and Sarah's devices before George replied, "Hey man, no one cares," through his own device. "Guys, my walkie's not working." Sarah turned around and explained it to Tom and George. The three had stopped walking as Sarah continued to play with her walkie-talkie in an attempt to fix it. "Just hit it a few times and it should work," George suggested, while nudging Sarah to keep walking the trail. George and Sarah resumed walking. However, Tom did not. "Guys!" a bewildered Tom yelled out while looking at the side of the trail. "Tom, what are you doing? Get over here!" George confusingly replied. However, Tom just continued to stare at the side of the trail, which prompted George and Sarah to join him. "What's wrong, Tom?" a concerned Sarah asked. "What is that?" Tom, very distressed, said out loud while pointing at something laying next to the trail 3 feet away from him. George and Sarah followed his finger and then also saw it. At the edge of the pathway sat a tree, and planted next to it resided a pelt of some sort. George grabbed a long stick and began inching his way closer to the furry, unidentifiable object. "What the hell is that?" George whispered as he now stood right next to it. What George saw at first led to weird confusion, but the more he saw, the more it turned into a blood-curdling sensation. It was flat, around 3 foot long, and its outside texture was wet, covered in torn brown fur. George firmly grasped the thick stick and slowly flipped over the heavy, furry object. Once turned over, all three fell instantly silent as they all lost their breath. This was no object of some sort, but what they were looking at was raw flesh from a large animal whose skin and fur was seemingly ripped off. The shiny wetness was dry blood covered into the animal's dead fur. This was not a normal phenomenon of predator versus prey. This was clearly something much more deliberate and gruesome, not the work of a human or an animal. Tom could no longer remain silent, as his brain had drawn a horrific conclusion that his nerves were not capable of handling. He let out a loud cry, followed by, "What the hell, guys? We need to leave!" However, his urging request was interrupted by a screeching noise coming from everyone's walkie-talkies. They all seemed to be malfunctioning at the same time, resulting in each of them quickly turning off their walkie-talkies. The sound, however, it did not stop. It continued to play. "What is going on?" Sarah worryingly asked out loud as the frequencies coming from their devices continued. "How is it still playing? Did you all turn yours off?" George asked. But both Tom and Sarah had turned off their devices, which therefore left no explainable reasoning for this noise. "I don't know what's going on, but we need to leave right now," Sarah strictly announced as they all began walking quickly back to the trail's beginning. The faster they walked, the seemingly louder the noise became that came through the walkie-talkie, until Tom, furious with it, decided that he wanted to turn around and chuck it 15 feet behind him to stop the unsettling noise. But as Tom turned around and looked back for that split second, he saw it. Tom's legs immediately fell silent and stopped moving, and his eyes burst in size as they were directly looking at it. The walkie-talkie he threw had landed right next to the creature. George, who quickly noticed the missing footsteps behind him, also turned around in an attempt to make sure his younger brother was still close to him. As Sarah noticed George turn around as well, she also did, and at that very moment, the walkie-talkies fell silent and the forest had gone completely numb again. But with this silence came an unexplainably grotesque discovery. Sarah, George, and Tom, who was considerably behind them, all piercingly gazed their eyes upon this unmistakable creature. It stood in the middle of the pathway, seemingly making its presence very instantly. Instead of running, Tom, George, and Sarah just stood there in disbelief and horror. It was nearly 7 feet tall, very skinny, bony, and lengthy. Its natural skin color was gray. However, the creature had patches of animal fur spread across its body. Each patch was a different color and texture sewn upon its exterior. The blood from its various victims still slowly leaking down its long and veiny legs. Created like a human, but his bones were dismembered and disfigured, as if it was trying to transition into another creature. Its head was long and narrow, with nothing on it but 2 beady black eyes, seemingly staring at all 3 of them. Before George or Sarah could even move and grab Tom to run, Tom softly began to walk towards the creature. The fear in Tom's eyes was indescribable, but his body continued to inch closer and closer to the creature, as if he had no choice in the matter. As George and Sarah watched on, they too could not control their movement, as their fear left them still and motionless, only their eyes locked onto Tom and the creature. Sweat began ferociously streaming down Tom's cheeks as he now stood a few feet in front of the demon-like creature. The creature's eyes were vigorously locked onto Tom, and each step closer made its eyes longer and stretched its glands. Before Tom could reach the creature itself decided to move closer to Tom. Its movement was violent, as each step left his bones and tendons colliding, creating a noise similar to nothing you've ever heard before. It really could not decide whether it wanted to walk or crawl towards Tom, but finally, it stood inches away from him. Slowly, the creature lowered its stance as its bones ruptured and tightened until Tom stood face to face with the most inhumane, torturous monster. George and Sarah began quietly whimpering as they stood in place, their tears creating a small puddle underneath their feet. Out of sheer determination and love, George managed to move his lips, muttering the words, "Tom, run!" Tom, incapable of moving a muscle, looked the creature in its small beady eyes, and that's when he saw what despair, hopelessness, and death looked like. It seemed that as soon as Tom realized his fate, the creature felt satisfied and slowly lifted his right arm until Tom saw its hand near his face. With an open stretched out hand, the creature seemingly sucked in Tom's face, whose head was smaller than the creature's fingers that wrapped around his dome, as if it leached on and became a part of his body. The very last thing Tom saw were 5 long, skinny fingers, whose nails fit perfectly into his eyes. As the creature continued its desires, it turned its head and began looking directly at George and Sarah, piercing their souls as they watched Tom's final moments. It seemed as if the creature enjoyed their pain and agony, as it made a point to stare them down as it mutilated Tom. Every wince and sob from Sarah and George seemed to please the creature, as their souls were also being fed on indirectly. Instead of leaving, George and Sarah with the same outcome. It peered at them instead, nudging them to leave with its deformed index finger. It clearly wanted George and Sarah to survive and to live with these memories for the rest of their lives. With all hope lost, Sarah desperately grabbed George's face, yelling at him, "We have to leave now!" With utter hollowness in his eyes, George took his final look at his younger brother before sprinting back to the entrance of Pinecone Trail with Sarah. From there, they found the bikes. However, Tom's blue Nitro bicycle was left behind, symbolizing the loss of George's younger brother. The bike ride home was everlasting. However, not a single word was said by either. As both returned to their homes, news broke of the incident later that day. Reporters and police scoured the mongoose forest the next morning, with no evidence in sight of any wrongdoings. George's mother heard the words she feared most in her life and didn't know how to cope with them. After that day, George and Sarah never spoke again, as the other was a reminder of what happened on June 22nd, 2016. That was the day their last adventure together took place, but for George, he had now found a new purpose in life. Every night for 2 years after the incident, George's walkie-talkie would transmit a voice similar to Tom's, pleading and begging for his older brother's help. "George, please come back. You need to help me." George knew this wasn't Tom, but still kept the signal open and listened to it, as that walkie-talkie Tom threw into the forest 2 years ago was the only thing keeping George in contact with the creature. George's purpose in life was no longer enjoyment or happiness. It was revenge, as he awaited the day where he would meet the creature once again. I hope you guys enjoyed that story and stay tuned for more.